Hello, this is video lecture number 99. Today we are talking about the American family on trial. Our subsections today are working families in the age of deindustrialization, navigating the sexual revolution, and religion in the 1970s, the Fourth Great Awakening. So the economic restructuring of this period produced stress on every institution, including the American family. Popular musicians, such as New Jersey's Bruce Springsteen, captured the mood of the times in such songs as Born in the USA from 1984, a cry of anguished patriotism set against the loss of a way of life experienced by Americans, particularly from the northeastern and midwestern states, a region called the Rust Belt, in reference to the closing down and boarding up of mills and factories there. So let's have a closer look at the effects of this Rust Belt and the effects of the American family on trial, with our first subsection, working families. One of the most striking developments of the 1970s and 80s was the relative stagnation of wages. Hardest hit were blue-collar and pink-collar workers and those without college degrees. Between 1973 and the early 1990s, every major income group except for the top 10% saw their real earnings, accounting for inflation, either remain the same or decline. Women streamed into the workforce, and Americans were fast becoming dependent on the two-income household. For a brief period in the 1970s, the trials of working men and women made a distinct imprint on regional culture. Reporters wrote of the blue-collar blues associated with plant closings and the hard-fought strikes of the decade. Across the nation, the number of union-led strikes surged, even as the number of Americans in the labor movement continued to decline. In most strikes and industrial conflict, workers won a measure of public attention, but typically gained little economic ground. When Americans turned on their televisions in the 1970s, the most popular shows reflected the blue-collar blues of struggling families. All in the Family was joined by The Waltons, which was set during the Great Depression, Good Times, Welcome Back Kotter, and Sanford and Son, all dealt with poverty in the inner city. The Jeffersons featured an upwardly mobile African-American couple. Laverne and Shirley focused on working girls in the 1950s, and One Day at a Time focused on working women in the 1970s, making do after divorce. The most watched television series of the decade, 1977's 8-part show Roots, explored the history of slavery and the survival of African-American culture and family, their roots, despite the oppressive labor system. Not since the 1930s had American culture paid such close attention to working class life. The decade also saw the rise of musicians such as Bruce Springsteen, Johnny Paycheck, and John Cougar Mellencamp, who became stars by turning the hard-scrabble lives of people in small towns and working class communities into rock anthems that filled arenas. Meanwhile, on the streets of Harlem and the South Bronx in New York, working-class African-American young men experimenting with dance and musical forms invented breakdancing and rap music, styles that express both the hardship and the creativity of working-class black life in the deindustrialized American city. Let's go to our next section now, navigating the sexual revolution. By the 1960s, sex before marriage had grown more socially acceptable, an especially profound change for women. And frank discussions of sex in media and popular culture had grown more common. In that decade, 3 developments dramatically accelerated this process. The introduction of the birth control pill, the rise of the baby boomer-led counterculture, and the influence of feminism. Widely available in the United States for the first time in 1960, the birth control pill gave women an unprecedented degree of control over reproduction. Women's rights activists reacted to the new emphasis on sexual freedom in at least two distinct ways. For many feminists, the emphasis on casual sex seemed to perpetuate male privilege. They argued that while men could now freely explore numerous sexual relationships without social sanction, women remained trapped by a culture that still required them to be innocent and not to sleep around, the old double standard. Moreover, sexual harassment was all too common in the workplace. The sexual revolution, these women argued, was by and for men. On the other hand, many feminists remained optimistic that the new sexual ethic could free women from those older moral constraints. They called for a revolution in sexual values, not simply behavior, that would end exploitation and grant women the freedom to explore their sexuality on equal terms with men. In the second half of the decade, networks on TV both exploited and criticized the new sexual ethic. In frivolous, lighthearted shows such as the popular Charlie's Angels, Three's Company, and The Love Boat, heterosexual couples explored the often confusing and usually comical landscape of sexual morality. At the same time, the major networks produced more than a dozen made-for-TV movies sensationalizing the potential threats to children posed by a less strict sexual morality. Many Americans worried that marriage itself was threatened. What defined a healthy marriage in an age of rising divorce rates, changing sexual values, and feminist critiques of the nuclear family? Only a small minority of Americans rejected marriage outright, but many people came to believe that they needed help as marriage came under a variety of stresses: economic, psychological, and sexual. A therapeutic industry arose in response. Churches and secular groups alike established marriage seminars and counseling services to assist couples in sustaining a healthy marriage. A popular form of 1960s psychotherapy, the Encounter Group, was adopted to marriage counseling. Couples met in large groups to explore new methods of communicating. Americans increasingly defined marriage not simply by companionship and sexual fidelity, but by the deeply felt emotional connection between two people. Let's go to the last section then, religion in the 1970s, or the Fourth Great Awakening. Evangelical churches emphasized an intimate, personal salvation, being born again, focused on the literal scripture of the Bible, and regarded the death and resurrection of Jesus as the central message of Christianity. These tenets distinguished evangelicals from mainline Protestants as well as from Catholics and Jews, and they flourished in a handful of evangelical colleges, Bible schools, and the seminaries in the post-war decades. No one did more to keep the evangelical fire burning than Billy Graham. A graduate of the evangelical Wheaton College in Illinois, Graham co-founded Youth for Christ in 1945 and then toured the United States and Europe preaching the gospel. Graham and other evangelicals in the 1950s and 1960s laid the groundwork for the Fourth Great Awakening. But it was the secular liberalism of the late 60s and early 70s that sparked the evangelical revival. Many Americans regarded feminism, the counterculture, sexual freedom, homosexuality, pornography, divorce, and legalized abortion not as distinct issues, but as a collective sign of moral decay in society. To seek answers and to find order, more and more people turned to evangelical ministries, especially Southern Baptist, Pentecostal, and Assemblies of God churches. As mainline churches lost about 15% of their membership between 1970 and 1985, evangelical church membership soared. Much of this astonishing growth came from the creative use of television. Graham had pounded the pavement and worn out his shoe leather to reach his converts by going on personal tours. But a new generation of preachers brought religious conversion directly into Americans' living rooms through television. these so-called televangelists built huge media empires through small donations from millions of avid viewers, not to mention advertising. Of primary concern to evangelical Christians was the family. Drawing on relevant passages from the Bible, evangelicals believed that the nuclear family, and not the individual, represented the fundamental unit of society. The family itself was organized along paternalist lines. Father was breadwinner and disciplinarian, and mother was nurturer and supporter. Wherever one looked in the 1970s and early 1980s, American families were under strain. Nearly everyone agreed that the waves of social liberalism and economic transformation that swept over the nation in the 60s and 70s had destabilized society, and especially family relationships. But Americans did not agree on how to restabilize families. Indeed, different approaches to the family would further divide the country in the 1980s and 1990s. And the new right would increasingly make family values a political issue. Okay, so that's it for today. That concludes our video lecture, so go ahead and answer your review questions at this time and continue on with your work.